Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this workshop for Thai listed companies. Today, we are going to discuss the TCFD current knowledge and reporting landscape. TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it was created by the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, to improve and increase the reporting of climate-related financial information. My name is Matthias, and I am CDP's Head of Corporate Engagement for Southeast Asia and Oceania, and I'll be the moderator for today's workshop. For those who are not familiar with CDP, it is an environmental organization that runs the world's largest platform and framework for corporate environmental reporting. We are an independent, not-for-profit charity that started about 22 years ago. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. We would like to seek your cooperation that firstly, all participants are muted on entry to avoid background noise. Secondly, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen throughout the event, and we will do our best to answer them. We will also have 2 dedicated Q&A sessions today to answer your questions after the presentations. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share a link to the recording and slide deck after the event. Before we get started, I would just like to briefly share some information and context as to why we are here today. This capacity building program is made possible by the UK government through funding from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The project is called UK PAC Green Recovery Challenge Fund, where PAC stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. The program is part of the UK's government commitment to tackle climate change, to work with partner countries and organizations such as CDP and Thailand to pursue greater climate action. This year's project has a theme shaping high-quality environmental disclosures in Thailand based on the TCFD recommendations and is an expansion of the previous year's project. Through funding and support from the UK PAC Green Recovery Challenge Fund, CDP and the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, had jointly developed and successfully delivered a capacity building program for listed companies and financial institutions in Thailand in partnership with and support from the Stock Exchange of Thailand, or SCT, and the British Embassy in Bangkok. Particularly, we hosted 7 workshops in Thailand on a range of topics focusing on best practices for corporate environmental action and reporting in the context of TCFD. We also translated selected TCFD reports from English to Thai, which are available on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. Carrying over from last year, we have conducted a capacity building program through a series of workshops, and today's workshop is the second workshop which is and has targeted listed companies. The first workshop was conducted on 2nd June last year and focused on capital markets and FIs. The next workshop later in the afternoon will be targeted mainly at policymakers and regulators. So this brings us to today's workshop, where we will focus on the need and landscape of Thai listed companies in advancing their TCFD disclosures journey. By attending this workshop, company representatives will develop a better understanding of the current regulatory trend of sustainability disclosure requirements, key concepts and core elements of TCFD recommendations, as well as the key actions that they can take to advance their TCFD disclosure journey. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and a big thank you to the UK PAC Green Recovery Fund and the British Embassy in Bangkok for making this capacity building program a reality. We would also like to extend thanks to our partner at the Securities and Exchange Commission of Thailand, who has been providing invaluable support in developing and rolling out this project. On this slide here is the agenda for today. The workshop will take about 2 hours and 40 minutes with a 10-minute break in between. The first section will focus on the current landscape of TCFD reporting, and the second section will focus on how companies can advance their TCFD disclosure journey. But before we kick off, I would like to invite Mr. John Leong from CDP for our opening address. John is CDP's Director for Southeast Asia and Oceania regions. He brings 25 years of general management and corporate development experience from the UK and Asia. He has expertise in spearheading new territory growth in Asia markets in both enterprise and startups, having spent nearly 20 years working in the region. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. John Leong. John, please.
Thank you, Matthias, for that warm welcome. Sawadee Krap, Ton Choi, everybody. I wish you a very good morning. I understand it's a little bit cold in Bangkok and Thailand today. I've heard it's only 19 degrees. I'm sitting in Singapore. It's actually been very cold recently as well, unseasonably cold during this past Lunar New Year. So I'd like to say that's not related to global warming or climate change, but I have a feeling it is. So if that's not enough to make us want to be part of the old climate change agenda, then I kind of don't know what is, given what's happening in our weather systems as a main indicator of how important it is to drive change. So on behalf of CDP, I'd firstly like to thank the Securities and Exchange Commission of Thailand for allowing us to do this webinar, the second of the year. And I'm delighted to be here with you. And this partnership, or this capacity building partnership, is done with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and is very important to drive more disclosure to for corporates and financial institutions in raising awareness for TCFD recommendations, and therefore shaping ambitious disclosure policy within Thailand. I'd also like to thank the British Embassy in Thailand, particularly Andrew Burney, the Economics and Prosperity Councillor and UK Permanent Representative for UNESCO, for their assistance and support. So CDP, just a quick reminder of who CDP is. We are a global non-profit that runs the world's environmental disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and governments to assess their impact and to take urgent action to build a truly sustainable world economy. We focus on investors, companies, cities, and governments on building a sustainable economy by measuring and acting on their environmental impact. We have an internal quote in CDP, and we often say and preach this: if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. So if you can measure your environmental impact, your climate change plans, then you will be able to manage that process. And that's at the heart of what we do. CDP has been at the forefront of environmental disclosure for more than 20 years. We were founded in the year 2000, so it's 23 years this year, playing a central role in the mainstream of disclosure and driving corporate action. For over a decade now, CDP has been driving nature-related disclosure through our water security and forest questionnaires, with almost 4,000 and over 1,000 companies respectively disclosing through these questionnaires in 2022, record levels. In fact, overall, CDP has over 18,700 institutions and over 1,000 cities, states, and regions disclosing to us, an annual increase of over 40%. And I think this year we're expecting more as people really focus on their climate change plans. By 2025, CDP aims to cover 90% of the world's highest impact firms. So it's really a real pleasure again to be here and talk to you, the audience in Thailand, as Thailand becomes part of that global disclosure program and drives a policy of climate change action. CDP has also supported development of both global baseline and comparable global reporting through what is called ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, and those developed by the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, as well as robust standards of development in jurisdictions including the EU and the US. On November the 8th last year, CDP announced that it will support ISSB, IFRS S2 climate-related disclosures into its global environmental disclosure platform. It's a major step towards delivering a comprehensive global baseline for capital markets, and it was set to be the global standard. And through the adoption of these standards, this will allow and provide investors and other stakeholders access to corporate environmental information that is consistent, comprehensive, and comparable across all global geographies. As the global environment disclosure system, CDP is committed to incorporating all high-quality global and jurisdictional level standards in our disclosure system to support companies with their reporting requirements and ensure global capital markets and policymakers have access to high-quality sustainable data produced under different incoming standards, and just to provide that overall consistency. And this also includes the European sustainability reporting standards and those in development of other jurisdictions, which is very important because as obviously a lot of Southeast Asian and Thai companies are part of a global supply chain. So just a little bit on UK PAC. Through the support of UK PAC's Green Recovery Challenge Fund and under the Shaping High Quality Environmental Disclosure in Thailand, based on TCFD related recommendations projects, CDP continues developing and rolling out capacity building programs for corporates and financial institutions in Thailand in partnership with the SEC. This aim is to equip financial institutions, listed companies, and other stakeholders with the necessary knowledge and skill sets to enhance your disclosure in alignment with the TCFD framework, and therefore drive Thailand's transition towards a low carbon economy. It is our hope that after this session, you'll get a better understanding of the current regulatory trend of sustainability disclosure, key concepts, the core elements of TCFD recommendations, and the key actions that you can take to advance your TCFD disclosure journey. And through case studies and practical examples that you'll hear later, you'll be able to develop a roadmap as your company embarks on your TCFD journey. We're also happy to announce that our report, Getting Started on TCFD, a practical guide to environmental stewardship, will be ready to launch in the English version and within a few weeks to give guidance on getting started on your TCFD disclosure journey. The report begins with a TCFD roadmap to help companies determine which stage of environmental maturity you are at. Companies can utilize this roadmap to identify actions required in relation to TCFD recommendations to move up the ladder towards environmental disclosure and stewardship. Thank you. We look forward to seeing more environmental transparency and more ambitious environmental action in a region that is already demonstrating impressive leadership. Without further ado, I will pass this back over to Matthias. Please enjoy the session.
Thank you, John. To start today's workshop, I will hand it over to my colleague, Ms. Elizabeth Loh, who is our Senior Corporate Engagement Officer. Elizabeth will provide an introduction and overview of the workshop today. Thank you. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Matthias. So hi, everyone. Over the next 40 minutes, I will give you an overview of the TCFD and regulatory trends, as well as highlight some key concepts of the TCFD. But before we jump in, allow me to provide a brief overview of CDP disclosure numbers last year. So here we have some figures that give a sense of CDP's global operations. So in 2022, over 18,000 companies worldwide submitted a response to CDP. And these companies responded either to a request for information issued on behalf of our 680 plus signatories or the 280 plus large purchasing organizations that use our supply chain program. And additionally, over 1,000 subnational governments disclosed through our cities, states, and regions program. So how has an increasing trend or focus on TCFD aligned reporting reflected in disclosure numbers in the Asia Pacific region last year? So as you can see on this graph here, over 6,000 corporates requested by investors and customers responded to our climate change questionnaire last year, which more than doubled when comparing to 2020. So the results also show that China is ahead of other markets across Asia Pacific in terms of disclosure, followed closely by Japan and Taiwan. And you can see in the red circle there that Thailand has seen almost 50% growth compared to last year. So that's really promising to see. And just briefly, John has mentioned this a bit before, but just to recap, the ISSB was announced by the IFRS Foundation in November of 2021. So essentially, the ISSB will be tasked with developing a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards for the financial markets. The intention is that these standards will provide a comprehensive information for global financial markets, and they will focus on the impact of sustainability on value creation, meaning the impact on the firm, which is so-called single materiality, which builds on existing frameworks such as TCFD. The framework will focus initially on climate-related sustainability disclosure, but these standards will not represent the entire sustainability reporting scope in terms of both metrics and topics. And it's notable that the CDP climate change questionnaire is already aligned with the ISSB IFRS S2 standard. So let us jump straight into TCFD. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you the context of how TCFD came about and some of the regulatory trends that we are seeing. So as many of you are probably aware, the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 by over 190 nations. And the focus of the agreement is to limit the pace of global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So to achieve this goal, countries commit to taking action through what is known as the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So when a country provides its NDC goals, it specifies the actions it will take to reduce emissions, and also provides action plans to develop resilience to climate change. So for instance, in 2020, Thailand released its second NDC. And in the plan, Thailand aims to increase its greenhouse gas emission reduction target to 30% by 2030, under a business as usual scenario from the baseline year of 2005. And Thailand also aims to meet the long-term goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 and net zero by 2065. However, NDCs alone will only limit warming to 2.4 degrees. When binding long-term or net zero targets are included, warming would be limited to about 2.1 degree above pre-industrial levels, or more likely temperature limit warming below 2.3 degree. And this is where you see the orange 2030 ambition gap is. So clearly action from the private sector is necessary if we are to reach net zero by 2050. So besides national level action, another area of consideration for companies is that the financial systems globally are also coming together to understand the risks of climate change in financial portfolios. So in 2017, central banks came together to understand these climate-related financial risks. And today, around 116 central banks are part of this coalition under the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, and the Bank of Thailand is one of its members. So this slide shows how climate change is intrinsically linked with traditional banking risks. For instance, banks could face credit risks on collateralized assets, such as property, that are impacted or damaged by extreme weather events and have a fall in market value. Similar risks are identified for businesses that are affected by drivers of climate change, such as technology, climate policy, and market sentiment. And as a result of these central bank guidance, financial institutions have started integrating and financially evaluating climate issues when investing or providing loans to companies. And companies worldwide have started to voluntarily report on climate-related financial risks and low-carbon opportunities. So as of March of 2022, 15 countries and territories had implemented or proposed to implement mandatory TCFD-aligned climate reporting. And these countries include the G7 countries, Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, just to name a few. To zoom in on the Southeast Asia region, 6 ASEAN states have all have some form of risk disclosure requirements. And the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum has also endorsed TCFD reporting, although this is not made mandatory yet. So we are seeing a lot of traction globally and in Asia Pacific on TCFD mandates, especially as more countries are announcing net zero goals, which must require private sector to work hand in hand in order to meet these goals. And we do expect to see initial voluntary reporting systems, such as that in Thailand, to shift into mandatory regimes. So given the breadth of climate change impacts across all sectors and geographies, regulators and policymakers in Asia Pacific are also moving towards increased disclosure on climate issues that impact companies. So in this regard, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD framework, is commonly known as, has emerged as a gold standard. And the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the TCFD framework provides companies the ability to assess the financial impacts of climate change on their business operations. And these financial impacts may be negative, such as disruption in business activities, but these impacts could also be positive, for instance, through low carbon opportunities and cost savings through resource efficiency. And the second reason, for TCFD being a gold standard is that the framework also enables companies to integrate these climate assessments within their existing business strategy. So as you can see on the slide, some regions have already started implementing the TCFD to enhance disclosure and the use of climate information in financial decisions. So New Zealand here became the first country in the world to mandate TCFD reporting, but recently Malaysia and Hong Kong have both come publicly in favor of TCFD reporting. And we do expect other Asian markets to follow over the next couple of years. And as you can see here on the slide, Thailand is also moving towards increased TCFD disclosures. Most notably, last year, the Bank of Thailand issued a consultation paper on potential policies to manage environmental risks in the financial sector, which included TCFD disclosure. So to understand where TCFD sits among the various different types of disclosure frameworks, let's take a look at this slide, which provides a simple and effective way to establish the building blocks for corporate reporting. So at the bottom left square is financial reporting. All companies are required to report on the financial health of its operations. And building on that are the ESG metrics that financially impact business operations. And this is where the TCFD framework comes in as it relates to financial reporting of climate risks and opportunities. And this information is useful to users with a specific interest in understanding enterprise value, such as investors. And overlaying that are the broader ESG metrics, such as the GRI standards that provide insights on a company's positive and negative contributions to sustainable development. And this information is useful to various users who want to understand the enterprise's positive and negative contributions to sustainable development. Now, you might wonder, with so many reporting frameworks available, why should I do TCFD? And how does my organization benefit from it? So in addition to regulatory push and increased investor scrutiny, as explained previously, the TCFD framework is actually a strategy exercise. It is also for this reason that the TCFD links very well with a company's ERM, or enterprise risk management framework. So if your company already has a long-term strategy developed, the slide shows how the TCFD framework fits within your existing strategy. So for instance, under the governance and culture pillar you see here, companies in Asia are now already identifying and reporting which board member and senior management own the climate strategy and are responsible for making business operations resilient to climate change. And likewise, a company's strategy and objectives fit very well with TCFD's climate scenario planning, as it aims to conduct vulnerability assessments and estimating climate-related negative and positive financial impacts. Metrics and targets identified under the TCFD fit into a company's performance goals. So a company can assess their current targets and consider future revisions to their TCFD roadmaps. And finally, the TCFD serves as a standalone report within the organization, but also to investors and stakeholders to demonstrate that your company has, firstly, robust procedures to understand financial impacts of climate change. And secondly, that your company has assessed how severe or not severe these impacts are estimated to be. And lastly, that there is a monitoring process in place to mitigate risks and capitalize on business opportunities related to low carbon. So in light of the importance of TCFD disclosure and to support companies who wish to begin reporting against TCFD, CDP has actually converted the 11 TCFD recommendations to rather straightforward questions. And the outcome of this conversion from the TCFD guidelines to CDP questions is shown on this mapping slide here. And again, you can see the 4 TCFD pillars with the corresponding recommendations below each one. And in red color, you can now see which questions within the CDP climate change questionnaire align to the recommendations. So as you can see, there are roughly 50 questions in your questionnaire that companies should answer to ensure full alignment with the 11 recommended TCFD disclosures. And this highlights the need for more comprehensive reporting. So I hope this session provides a sufficient backdrop on the need for developing climate-related business and financial strategies for companies. So in the following session, I will discuss the various concepts of the TCFD framework, as well as the 4 pillars in more detail. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to briefly introduce the TCFD, highlight some key elements of TCFD disclosure, and then we'll point towards future developments of TCFD reporting. So with the aim of developing a set of global guidelines for reporting on how climate change impacts corporate performance, the TCFD issued a set of disclosure recommendations centered on the 4 pillars as seen here on the right. So these thematic areas represent the core of TCFD disclosure and should be understood holistically, meaning they are a set of recommendations that are designed to work together in service of greater transparency. The government's pillar asks companies to disclose the roles and responsibilities of the board and senior management team with respect to managing climate-related risks. The strategy disclosure requires companies to report on how their strategic and financial planning are impacted by climate-related risks and opportunities over various time horizons. And in terms of risk management, the TCFD asks companies to report on processes for quantifying and managing these risks within the context of their overall risk management systems. And finally, companies can address the metrics and targets pillar by disclosing how they track their impact on climate change, as well as the practices for setting and achieving climate targets. And before we get into the specific recommendations, let's take a look at the guiding principles behind the TCFD recommendations. So here we have some of the key ideas and themes behind the recommendations. So the purpose of these principles is to provide company stakeholders with clear, comparable, and decision-useful information on the actual and possible impacts of climate change on the company. So the recommendations were initially voluntary, and they remain so in most jurisdictions. But as mentioned earlier, regulators worldwide have shown interest in mandatory TCFD disclosure. So climate-related disclosure should be as robust, comprehensive, and accessible in the same manner as financial filings are required to be, and they should be included in mainstream reports. The recommendations were initially targeted to certain sectors with an outsized impact on the climate, and these sectors still remain a priority, although companies from all sectors are increasingly expected to report. Disclosing companies are expected to consider and report on both physical and transition risks, And we'll go into greater detail about these risk types in a later slide. A TCFD aligned report should be forward-looking and communicate the company's vision for addressing risks and seizing opportunities, ideally through the use of scenario analysis, which I will also touch on later. And because climate change poses risks that may not align with business and credit cycles, data reported should be relevant across time horizons. And finally, fulsome disclosures contain both quantitative and qualitative elements, and each of the recommended disclosures call for a different balance of these types of information. Now, with that context, let's look at the recommendations themselves. So here we have each of the 4 pillars and the 11 recommended disclosures underpinning these pillars. So firstly, on the left, in the governance pillar, the TCFD asks companies to disclose the governance structures and mechanisms used to address climate issues. The recommended disclosures ask about board level oversight of climate issues and management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. So companies new to reporting can start by disclosing existing governance structures and work to incorporate strengthened governance measures over time. And many companies begin by publishing a policy or commitment statement on climate change. As for the second pillar of strategy, companies are asked to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risk and opportunities in the context of the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. So just to break this down, the recommended disclosures ask, for instance, what are the risks that you have identified so far over varying timeframes? And having identified these risks, what are the estimated impacts? And then given these impact assessments, what is your strategy to guard against or address those risks? So early stage companies can begin by carrying out reduction initiatives for the operational greenhouse gas emissions and join perhaps domestic or global initiatives to mitigate climate change as they develop a strategy to address climate issues. So on the third pillar, risk management, this pillar asks companies to disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. And here you're asked to report, for instance, how do you assess and identify risks? What are the processes involved, and how do they relate to both physical and transitional risks? What are the systems and processes are used to monitor and manage these risks? And how do these issues of climate risk fit into your overall risk management system? So here again, early stage companies can begin by acknowledging the need to assess and respond to climate-related risks, even if they lack the capacity to do so. And with respect to climate and targets, metrics and targets, TCFD asks companies to disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. So for instance, what measurements or tools do you use to measure climate risk and opportunity? What are the emissions, both direct emissions, your scope 1 and scope 2, or indirect scope 3 emissions? And what risks does this footprint expose you to? And for instance, having established how you measure your emissions and what those measurements indicate, what targets have you established to improve performance, and how do you measure progress against the targets? So here, companies can begin by assessing their direct scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and use this as a baseline for further progress. So the next question would be, who is TCFD targeted at? So here you can see on the right that we have the sectors initially targeted by the TCFD, and these fall into 2 buckets, the financial group and the non-financial group. For the financial group, the aim is for these companies to report on financed emissions. And insurers. Okay. So yes, so here on the right, we have the sectors initially targeted by the TCFD. And these fall into 2 buckets. I don't know. Okay. Apologies for the technical issues. Yeah. So on the right here, we have two sectors initially targeted by the TCFD. And these fall into two buckets, the financial group and the non-financial group. For the financial group, the aim is for these companies to report on financed emissions, and banks will review emissions associated with their lending. And insurers will look at underwritten emissions. Asset owners will report on emissions associated with their investments, while asset managers will report on the climate implications of their asset management practices. The purpose in targeting financial institutions is both to more accurately price climate risks and to allocate capital towards firms with low carbon intensity. Measuring and reporting relevant data helps these firms to avoid risk and identify investment opportunities aligned with the realities of climate change. So sectors in the non-financial group are especially carbon and energy intensive. And as you can see here, we have the energy sector, transportation, and so on. Like financial institutions, companies in these sectors benefit by identifying and avoiding risks and positioning themselves to better seize opportunities. And this leads to greater capacity to attract capital for growth. So while these industries remain a priority, this list is not exhaustive, and companies with similar environmental profiles are also encouraged to disclose. Essentially, all organizations should disclose because climate risk is non-diversible and has the potential to have systemic impacts across all parts of the economy. And since disclosure expectations from investors and other stakeholders, including regulators, are increasingly tied to market cap rather than sector, companies from all sectors need to begin reporting. So the task force also recommends that the TCFD disclosure should be provided in mainstream financial filings, which would mean your annual report. And the rationale is simple. When the impact of climate change can be measured in financial terms and integrated into and connected to financial information, climate issues, for instance, climate risks can then be comparable with regular business risks and be brought up to the top of the agenda. So this should in turn accelerate the development of practices and solutions to combat climate change. And additionally, when climate disclosures are integrated into financial filings, these information would be subject to the same governance process and sign off as standard financial information. And this would ensure that climate information reported is robust and comprehensive. But of course, as a starting point, companies are encouraged to report on the TCFD recommendations through other standalone reports, such as Sustainability Report or CDP Disclosure. However, it is important to keep in mind the intended aim of the TCFD and to work towards integrated reporting. So one of the most important concepts in TCFD reporting is materiality. And this is important because materiality determines which information should be included in the disclosure and which should not be. And this is in part determined by the audience of the report. So the International Accounts Standards Board provides that information should be considered material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence the decisions of the primary users of the report. So in other words, information is material if excluding or compromising this information could cause users to make decisions that they may otherwise not have made had they been provided with this information. So essentially, information is financially material to the extent that this information is necessary for an understanding of the company's development, performance, and position. And climate data is therefore considered a financial material if the environmental conditions impact company performance. And as you can see here, that the TCFD and IFRS standards and most authorities focus on the financial materiality of reporting. And this is the same for ISSB as well. And in contrast, environmental and social materiality extends this idea to include the impacts of the company on the environment. And the concept of double materiality encompasses both the impacts of the company on the environment and vice versa. So here, GRI and CDP, for instance, take a more expansive view of materiality, along with the EU and the Stock Exchange of Malaysia, for example. So as a primary audience for a TCFD report is actors in the capital markets, the TCFD focuses on financial materiality. However, it is important to note that stakeholders across the board are increasingly adopting a double materiality lens. So we can now consider how the TCFD links climate data and risks and opportunities, which you'll find above the dotted line, and financial impact elements below the dotted line. So starting from the left, the TCFD divides climate-related risks into two classes, the first being transition risks, which relate to the transition to a low-carbon economy, and the second being physical risks, which are associated with the physical implications of climate change. So each class can be divided into subclasses. For transition risks, this means policy and legal risks like increased pricing of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as a risk related to technology, including the costs associated with switching to lower emissions equipment. There are also market and reputational risks, which are associated with the changing consumer and stakeholder attitudes. And then in terms of physical risks, these can be broken down into acute and chronic risks. So acute risks are event-driven episodes like severe weather, flooding, and chronic risks refer to long-term shifts in precipitation, temperature, and weather patterns. And at the same time, climate change does bring opportunities in the form of greater energy efficiency and access to new energy sources. So opportunities can take the shape of low emissions products and services and access to new markets. And this is becoming particularly important in jurisdictions and with ambitious climate targets, such as net zero. Opportunities for greater resilience, for instance, through diversification, also appear. So whatever the company and its particular circumstances, these risks and opportunities have direct impacts on the company's financial elements listed below. For instance, in terms of corporate income statements, changes in customer demands could lead to increased revenues for companies that offer low emissions goods and services. And on the other hand, legal and policy developments could raise expenditure in the form of higher compliance and litigation costs. With respect to balance sheets, physical risks, whether acute or chronic, could cause the early retirement or write-off of assets, either through damage or because assets are understood to be in high-risk locations. And on the other hand, companies switching to new energy sources could enjoy expanded access to capital as investors increasingly favor low-carbon energy generation. So in short, climate change will present each company with a unique set of risks and opportunities, and the TCFD enables all companies to consider how risks and opportunities affect its current and future financial positions. So I hope this gives you an understanding of the background and goals of the TCFD. So another feature of TCFD disclosure is that reports are meant to be forward-looking. So a key method in preparing a forward-looking disclosure is the use of climate-related scenario analysis, which enables companies to develop plans in the context of uncertainty with respect to future climatic conditions. Scenario analysis gives companies the opportunity to explore the implications of alternatives to business as usual assumptions. A scenario describes a pathway of development that leads to a particular outcome. So a 1.5 degree scenario, for instance, would include assumptions concerning the changes that would be necessary to achieve a world with limited changes to the climate. Scenario analysis is a tool to enhance critical strategic thinking. It should be understood as narratives based on multiple scenarios and assumptions. So depending on the different scenarios, there will be a set of assumptions made about the future and the action taken by, for example, regulators or customers. Companies can then analyze how their business would fare under these different conditions. And the TCFD guidelines ask companies to consider the different pathways towards a 2-degree or lower scenario in order to understand the resilience of the company's strategy. And this will show users of your report that your company has a plan to thrive as the climate changes. Investors and regulators do not expect companies to have a crystal ball, but carrying out and reporting on climate-related scenario analysis shows your stakeholders that a company is prepared for a variety of future climate conditions. And this will demonstrate transparency concerning the company's resilience in the face of possible futures. So what is important is not so much the credibility of the results of the analysis, but rather the company showing responses to expected futures. And of course, it is impossible to predict the future, but what companies can do is ensure that their business and strategy is resilient to potential risks that will arise, no matter whether we find ourselves on a 1.5-degree trajectory or 3.4-degree trajectory. So what exactly are scenarios? In short, climate scenarios lay out possible future states at differing levels of warming predicted. The graph to the left illustrates how different emission levels lead to different temperature outcomes. The business as usual outcomes are represented in gray, and the emissions reduction needed to limit warming to 2-degree and 1.5-degree are represented in yellow and green. These projections are based on current and possible policies, pledges, and targets. So to the right, we have a number of risks associated with the more optimistic 1.5-degree and 2-degree scenarios. As you can see, the risks across all indicators multiply as temperatures increase. And these projections help companies to think through future climate conditions and the impact of these conditions on corporate performance. Scenario analysis allows a company to think through the risks and opportunities associated with each of these possible futures and to plan accordingly. So while it is, of course, important to understand these scenarios and associated risks in detail and to consider what they mean to your business, the key point here is no matter which scenario are used in your analysis, there will always be some level of risk associated with climate change. And the capital markets increasingly expect companies to have plans to navigate these risks. We are seeing increasingly more companies setting net zero targets, which are emission reduction targets that align with the 1.5 trajectory. However, companies are not fully addressing future climate risk elements with a robust net zero target and transition plan alone, since the world is not yet on track to meet 1.5 degree. Therefore, I need to stress the importance of risk assessments based on climate scenario analysis. So companies are asked to consider different pathways and what the risks are to these. The TCFD recommends that companies look at least 2 scenarios to compare different outcomes and to be prepared for the different risks that may face your company. And as we will see in the next slide, scenarios can differ drastically, and it's important to understand how your company will perform under the varying climate conditions. So as using scenarios help companies understand the risk and opportunities associated with different climate trajectories, it may be helpful to take a closer look at the role that assumptions play in scenarios. So all scenarios and scenario analysis include certain assumptions and analytical methods. And so companies are asked to detail these when reporting the use and results of scenario analysis. So here we have a simple chart showing some of the risks and opportunities associated with the 1.5 degree scenario. That is to say, a series of assumptions on what changes to business as usual practices would lead to a global temperature increase of 1.5 degree and a 3.5 degree scenario, which again carries a series of assumptions on what would need to happen in order to yield a warming of 3.4 degree. So without going into too much detail about the assumptions and risks associated with each of these scenarios, we can see that they present a very different set of risks. The 1.5 degree scenario indicates an orderly transition expedited with instruments such as a carbon tax and changes in energy supply and development of green technologies. And on the other hand, a disorderly 3.4 degree scenario anticipates few changes in climate policy and energy supply, but correspondingly more extreme physical risks in the shape of Arctic melting, crop failure, and widespread flooding. So clearly, the strategies needed to adapt to 1.5 degree scenario would be quite different from the strategy needed to adapt to a 3.4 degree scenario. And companies may report varying degrees of resilience for each scenario. And this is why the TCFD recommends carrying out scenario analysis using a variety of scenarios. And finally, we should note that the time horizons are a key component of scenario analysis, as risks in each scenario will unfold at varying timescales. Some risks emerge immediately, whereas others appear later. And as such, companies are asked to report the results of their scenario analysis across different timeframes. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the key features of TCFD reporting. So now I'd like to turn briefly to how the TCFD has been rolled out and what we can expect in the future. So here we have the implementation path envisaged by the TCFD upon the launch of the recommendations in 2017. The expectations included widespread adoption of the framework and use of tools like scenario analysis and reporting comprehensive, complete, and consistent information within the 5-year timeframe. And the implementation path indicated a broad understanding among capital market players of the concentration of carbon-related assets in the financial system. But in reality, as we will see in the next slide, levels of reporting have not reached expectations, and the data quality can be uneven, although progress has been made. Nonetheless, companies may wish to use this implementation chart to determine where their organization sits on the path and to determine next steps. So for example, if your company is just beginning to consider climate-related issues, a next step would be to drive greater integration of climate issues in strategic considerations. And this would better position your company to establish the metrics and targets necessary to more fully understand and ultimately manage your emissions profile. And this will remain important, both in terms of better managing your own climate risks, as well as keeping up with peer companies as the scale and quality of TCFD reporting continues to grow. So that was the anticipated implementation path. We can now review the actual implementation of the TCFD since the recommendations were issued. And to do that, we can look to the TCFD's 2021 status report. So this was written to assess the current status of disclosure practices as they relate to TCFD recommendations, to highlight challenges, and to give a comprehensive view of the state of play. So the key findings were that over 2,600 public companies and financial institutions spanning 89 countries and jurisdictions either support the TCFD or report in line with the TCFD recommendations, or both. And this suggests that releasing a TCFD-aligned report is increasingly seen as best practice among leading companies worldwide. Among all companies, energy companies and materials and buildings companies lead on disclosure, and much of this progress has been driven by investor efforts. This paper also examined reports for around 1,600 companies across 8 sectors, and the task force surveyed companies on efforts to implement the recommendations and expert users on the usefulness and relevance of the TCFD-aligned disclosures. And the findings show that although disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased since 2017, further progress is needed. And in particular, companies' disclosure of the resilience of the strategies under different climate-related scenarios remain the least reported among the TCFD recommendations. But what is encouraging, however, is that reporting on climate resilience increased from 5% of companies in 2018 to 13 companies in 2020. So despite these gaps, expert users do see the impacts of climate change on the company's business and strategy as most useful for decision-making. Active investors in particular leveraged disclosure of actual and potential financial impacts of climate change for financial impact assessments. So companies consider the areas highlighted by expert users when prioritizing their efforts. And given the relevance and value identified by expert users, the demand for high quality, transparent TCFD reporting is expected to grow. So we'll stop here briefly for questions before I hand over to the next speaker for the next session.
Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth. We now have some time for Q&A, about 10 minutes before we embark on a break. And we have some questions coming in already. But for everybody, please click on the Q&A button and feel free to share any other questions that you may have. Okay, but for Elizabeth, the first question has come in is around materiality, and it's not materiality is something that I think could be quite differentiated for different companies and across different sectors. So question for you, Elizabeth, do you have any recommendations, suggestions on how companies can look at this, can look and identify, what climate issues are material to them?
Yes, so I would guess looking at what your peers are doing would be helpful. So for instance, if you're in the oh, sorry, is this question on like risk, climate risk, or in general materiality?
Yeah, so materiality to a company, around the climate risk.
Right. So I would first sort of identify kind of which is my core business activity, because it's likely that because let's say if I'm a conglomerate and my kind of core activity is, let's say, energy generation, then perhaps that would have the most materiality, and most likely climate risks and climate issues. The more kind of material climate issues would relate to my energy generation activities, and I'll probably start from there, and then I would probably look at kind of what my peers are doing, look at their kind of sustainability reports or even CDP disclosures, see what they identify as their material topics. And then, I mean, there are also kind of multiple things to consider. It's quite a wide, I guess, quite a vague question, but it's also important to consider your geographical location, various kind of like market factors, legal factors, whether the regulatory, whether let's say carbon pricing regulations, or whether the location where you operate is greatly impacted by the physical impacts of climate change. So there are many factors to consider, and we'll actually go through all of these. We'll go through physical and transition risks later in the later session. But yeah, I would probably look through all these kind of physical and socioeconomic aspects, and then kind of determine where the material impact is.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so another question that came in is actually a little bit on the integrated reporting, but also I think we can also take the question back into like integrated reporting internally and externally. So internally, the question would be, you mentioned there are links between TCFD disclosures as well as like, existing, looking at TCFD or climate risk, as part of the enterprise risk management system. But you also mentioned as a starting point, externally, that a lot of companies are simply just looking at climate and reporting climate as a standalone report. So, could you just share, what are the benefits, I guess, to integrating this reporting both internally and externally?
Okay, so internally, I would assume I assume we're talking about the double materiality concept. So I would say Yeah, I would say so. So the internal reporting would kind of mean, assessing the impact of the environment or climate change on the company itself, right? So that's kind of like on value creation, on the company's value creation. And on the other side, when we talk about double materiality, we're also talking about, in addition to kind of the environment's impact on the company's value creation, we also talk about the company's impact on the environment. So that's kind of that goes both ways. And I think increasingly regulators and investors are looking at both. And actually, well, I would say most investors would probably be more interested in learning about the company's value creation more, but we have other kind of regulators, other stakeholders. We're also looking at what companies what their impact is on the environment as well. And we're seeing, let's say in Europe, right? Some countries are already, or some investors and regulators are already mandating that double materiality concept. So yeah, I guess, doing integrated reporting will help you prepare for that, regulation that is coming.
Okay, so I guess there are participants that kind of mentioned GRI reporting, which is kind of, I guess, the larger ambit of ESG. Could you share a little bit whether how well GRI reporting kind of relates to this whole climate reporting journey? Is it enough for companies to just do GRI reporting, or should they go beyond GRI reporting?
Yeah, I think companies, obviously GRI reporting is important, but also I think TCFD is also important, and companies should consider doing both. And the reason is because the TCFD framework is mostly targeted at investors. The purpose of the TCFD is for investors to look at how companies are valued when climate change comes in, when climate change impacts the company, and how a company would be valued, in the short term and in the long term. And as we mentioned before, ISSB is coming, and the kind of the North Star or the goal of the ISSB is essentially integrate all of these different reporting standards into one integrated reporting standard. And TCFD is part of that I guess formula. TCFD will be part of that kind of climate aspect of the ISSB reporting framework. And so really, all of these reporting frameworks, GRI, TCFD, and all that, I think they're really just to prepare you for that kind of integrated reporting that will come in the future. And yeah, so that's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the world is looking forward to see what ISS brings to the table in terms of, like say, merging the different reporting standards. Currently, they may be a bit separated, but yeah, it's very useful to, I guess, to see all in one place. And talking about that, about bringing everything to one place, do you think, we have this question from the audience, do you think that it is useful to kind of consolidate all this reporting, at least for climate, into one single, database? Is that something that Thailand should be thinking about?
Well, consolidating all climate information into, I would say, maybe probably in a sustainability report, which I assume most listed companies are already doing. But if we're talking about TCFD in particular, right? It is recommended by the task force that TCFD information or TCFD disclosure should be integrated into financial reporting, and that there actually is a reason for this. Obviously, most companies now, they integrate TCFD into their sustainability reporting, but not their annual financial reporting. But the task force recommends that this information, the TCFD recommendation, be included in financial reporting because they want to accelerate action on on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Because when you include TCFD information in financial reporting, the financial impact of climate change and financial impact from regular business risks would then be comparable. And this is how you bring kind of climate issues up to the top of the agenda, let's say on the board or on the management level. So that's kind of the whole point of the TCFD, is to allow climate risks and opportunities to be, you know, discussed in the same kind of manner and with the same importance as regular business risks. So I guess my conclusion is, you know, yes, it'd be helpful to you know, consolidate all of your climate information into one single integrated sustainability report, but you know, for the purpose of accelerating climate action, it would be also, you know, helpful for investors and for the, I guess, the whole sustainability space, for that TCFD information in particular to be included in financial reporting as well.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. We are out of time for questions, but we do have another Q&A at the end of the second presentation. So maybe I will leave. There is another question on scenario analysis, but I will leave that for the next Q&A. We would just like to take some time for a little break. So the time now is 12:07 p.m. You know, could I just ask for everybody to take a 5 minutes break and return at 12:12 p.m. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you once again. And you know, we hope you will come back, and we welcome you for the second part of the presentation on, you know, specific how companies can embark specifically on their TCFD roadmap. Hi, everyone. So welcome back from the break. You know, for the second section of this workshop, both Ms. Elizabeth Loh as well as Ms. Kelly So, you know, will be taking you through how companies could advance their TCFD journey going forward. So Elizabeth and Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Matthias. Yeah, so in the next 30 minutes, I'll go over some practical guidance on governance and climate scenario analysis. And then I'll hand over to Kelly to cover climate risks and climate risk management. Okay, so we'll first dive into the governance pillar, understand the typical steps an organization goes through when attempting to incorporate climate issues within the governance structure. And I'll also walk you through some guiding principles when you start thinking about how you can incorporate climate governance within your organization. So the governance pillar is intended to capture the governance structure of your company with regards to climate change, and it provides data users with an understanding of the organization's approach to climate-related issues at the board and management levels. So the slide on the screen shows the typical steps we often see companies go through to reach best practice in climate governance. Climate governance often starts with simply being a generic topic on the agenda of the board and management meetings. And next from this, we often see targets and goals being set, especially by the board. And this can be emissions reduction targets or other types of environmental initiatives. And after that, an important step is to implement mechanisms to be able to effectively evaluate and assess what the company is doing at the management level to implement and achieve these goals and objectives. And finally, we see the actual outcomes of this work, ideally leading to improved environmental performance. And board level oversight of climate issues is considered best practice and provides a strong indication of the importance of climate issues to your organization. But before we dive into sort of the practical guidance to implementing corporate governance, let's take a look at how Thai corporates have performed in terms of governance in 2022 based on CDP data. So across Southeast Asia, all countries have seen an increased number of companies having board level oversight over climate issues from 2021 to 2022. And in Thailand, there was a 12% increase. So last year, 75 companies, or almost 80% of companies in Thailand, have board level oversight over climate issues, just behind Singapore. So it is promising to see that climate issues are on the top of the agenda for most Thai companies. And when we dive deeper into whether climate-related incentives are provided to management personnel, we can see that over half of Thai respondents do not. So whilst we can see that climate issues are increasingly being prioritized by the highest levels of governance, more work needs to be done in terms of incentivizing and accelerating climate action at the operational level. And this is also important for realizing corporate targets and goals. So here we can see that the TCFD recommendations under the governance pillar on the left side of the screen, and the corresponding CDP questions that address these on the right side. So we ask companies whether there is board level oversight of climate issues within their organization, what the highest management level responsibility for managing these issues are. And we also drill down further to understand what are the specific roles of the board and senior management positions when it comes to climate oversight and management. In addition, I've also included some of the response details that companies should include to make this a comprehensive response. So if you just look at the TCFD recommended disclosures at face value, some of them are probably just yes/no questions, but it's important to provide more detail so that your disclosure is comprehensive and transparent. So for instance, in our questionnaire, in addition to asking if there is board level oversight over climate issues, we also ask you to describe the mechanisms in place to ensure that the issues are discussed at the board level, are taken down the chain to management and effectively implemented, monitored, and reported throughout the organization. And to support companies who are unsure of how to respond to these questions or what possible actions their organization can take, the CDP questionnaire provides drop-down options which you can select from, and you can use our questionnaire as a reference point for your TCFD disclosure and future action points as well. So here are some guiding principles when considering integrating climate issues into your organization's governance structure. So on the structural level, meaning where sustainability or climate considerations or functions should be situated within the organization, companies should consider whether these should be integrated into existing committees, for instance, your existing corporate governance committee, or within a dedicated sustainability or climate committee. And this would depend on your organizational context, but some things to consider would be, for instance, whether the management style and culture of your company is more conducive to collaborative or specialized approach, whether existing committees or staff have the expertise to scrutinize climate risks and opportunities. And even if current staff have the expertise, whether they have the bandwidth to expand their scope of work into climate-related work. And this could mean, expansion into leadership roles or more technical roles, which would require more time and resources. Secondly, board members responsible for climate issues should also be in positions that will allow them to influence board decisions. So for instance, if a board member is in an executive position, such as a committee chair, they are more likely to have direct responsibility over important decisions, such as setting climate targets and improving internal carbon pricing mechanisms. And thirdly, in order for climate actions to be implemented effectively, the way climate considerations are embedded into the organization should allow for effective interaction with relevant members of executive management. So for instance, if climate is embedded into the risk committee, then climate should also be addressed by the chief risk officer. As we touched on briefly before, climate incentives should also be part of management's incentivization model, or put simply, be part of their KPIs to ensure accountability. These KPIs should also ideally be linked to their remuneration package, such as year-end bonus. Take note that climate incentives or KPIs should not be contradictory or to other business incentives. So for example, in an extreme case, a target of 4% absolute emission reduction across the entire company could contradict with the expansion of 5 new gas exploration sites. And lastly, the board should also have the necessary expertise and skills to oversee climate-related issues. Executive directors are operationally accountable and should have greater insight into the management of climate-related risks, while non-executive directors may bring certain expertise or perspectives with relation to climate change. In terms of assessing whether relevant board members have climate expertise, we can ask ourselves, for instance, has an assessment of the climate competence gap been conducted on board members? Recommendations provided by subject matter experts. And if external subject matter experts are not available, then they might need to be appointed if external experts are lacking. So now let's talk about the implementation of climate scenario analysis. Sorry, wrong slide. Sorry. So from what we know, there are two common approaches to start setting up a climate governance structure. And the first is what we call the dedicated approach. And the example illustrated here is taken from one of the leading real estate companies in Southeast Asia. And in their approach, the company has set up a separate sustainability committee that reports directly to the board. So the board sustainability committee comprises of 3 independent directors and the group CEO. The committee meets at least twice a year to review the company's ESG performance, including carbon performance, looking at potential risks and opportunities, including climate issues, and they set the strategic direction for the implementation of various actions, including low carbon initiatives. So at the management level, this company has a sustainability committee that is responsible for supporting the company's ESG strategies and measuring key performance indicators. This committee is chaired by the CSO and reports to the group CEO and the board. And this management committee is company-wide and multidisciplinary, comprising of representatives from both the management and working levels, cutting across all corporate and operational units that are material to the business. So having this comprehensive approach at the management level ensures that this company is addressing all aspects of their business and takes a realistic and holistic approach to governance and action on climate-related issues. And furthermore, this company also recognizes that the inclusion of ESG issues within executive management goals and incentive schemes is an important factor in promoting accountability for achieving these goals. So to do so, this company has monetary incentives, such as performance bonuses in place that are tied to environmental targets and goals. So we know that monetary incentives are effective motivators and are helpful in ensuring that the goals of the board and senior management is implemented and realized throughout the organization. So you can see here that this is quite a holistic approach to climate governance. This company has board level oversight and also has a multidisciplinary management group that is directly responsible for realizing the ambitions of the board. And to further strengthen this company has frequent reporting between the committees as well as monetary incentives to make sure action is taken. The second approach to climate governance is called the integrated approach. And this approach, or this example, is taken from one of the leading CDP disclosures in Thailand. So in their approach, they have integrated their sustainability function within their risk management and corporate governance committee, which report directly to the board. The corporate governance committee and risk management committee, which comprises of 4 board members, have direct responsibility over the approval of near and long-term climate targets, as well as renewable energy projects, as well as internal carbon pricing mechanisms. The board chair manages and resolves the climate change mitigation conflicts between the 2 committees. So at the management level, the Sustainability Steering Committee, which is chaired by the CEO, oversees the corporate sustainability strategy. The CEO is also a member of the Risk Management Committee, along with 4 board members, which facilitates effective communication and coordination between the board and executive management on climate-related risk management. In terms of climate incentivization, again, the management's compensation and bonuses are dependent on meeting corporate level KPIs. So in this model, we can see that, whilst there is not a dedicated sustainability committee directly reporting to the board, the company's existing committees and their board members have direct accountability to the realization of climate targets and goals. And the board members within the Corporate Governance Committee are incentivized to realize these goals. So for organizations with a more collaborative approach to management, or with less resources to set up new management arm entirely, this could be an effective way to incorporate climate governance within your governance structure. Okay, so this is governance. So next, let's talk about the implementation of climate scenario analysis, which in my experience is an area where most companies struggle with. So just to recap, climate scenarios lay out possible future states at different levels of warming predicted. So scenario analysis allows a company to think through the risks and opportunities associated with each of these possible features and to plan accordingly. So scenario analysis can be qualitative, relying on descriptive written narratives, or they can be quantitative, relying on numerical data and models, or some combination of both. So qualitative scenario analysis explores relationships and trends for which little or no numerical data is available. And in contrast, quantitative scenario analysis can be used to assess measurable trends and relationships using models and other analytical techniques. Both rely on scenarios that are internally consistent, logical, and based on explicit assumptions and constraints that result in plausible future development paths. So the task force recognizes that organizations will be at different levels of experience in using scenario analysis. And for organizations that are just beginning to use scenario analysis, organizations may choose to start with qualitative scenario analysis or narratives or storylines to help management explore the potential range of climate change implications. For organizations that have more extensive experience in conducting analysis, greater rigor and sophistication in the use of data and quantitative models and analysis may be warranted. And quantitative approaches may be achieved by using existing external scenarios and models, such as those provided by third-party providers, or by organizations developing their own in-house modeling capabilities. The choice of approach will depend on an organization's needs, resources, and capabilities. So whichever approach you select, you will also need to consider the scope of application. So is the analysis applied to the whole value chain, meaning your inputs, operations, and markets, or just the direct effects on the specific material business units or operations? So as mentioned earlier, the TCFD recommends that companies look at least two scenarios to compare different outcomes and to be prepared for the different risks that may face your company. So there are several principles to keep in mind when selecting which scenarios to use. So firstly, the scenario selected should be high contrast, meaning a company should prepare for both the worst case and best case scenarios. There are generally a few types of scenarios. So firstly, a smooth and orderly transition to a low carbon economy, which is associated with a global average temperature increase of 2 degrees or lower. Secondly, a lack of transition or transition based on known technology and policy developments, which meaning currency policy scenarios, which result in higher temperature increases. Other scenarios move away from this dichotomy and can describe a disorderly transition where stringent policies kick off at a later date to meet climate commitments. Secondly, each scenario should be balanced, meaning the scenario selected should sufficiently consider both physical and socioeconomic impacts of climate change. And this is important to obtain a well-rounded picture of the physical and transition risks associated with your organization in various timeframes. Third, the scenario selected should be science-based, meaning the data projection conducted for the scenario should be made on the basis of scientific analysis, for instance, on research findings or simulation. The majority of scenarios widely utilized by companies such as RCP and SSP are based on climate science. Lastly, scenarios used should be comparable. For instance, the climate indicators and time horizons used the scope of business operations the scenario is applied to should be consistent over time. So after selecting a scenario, it is important to understand its driving data sets and assumptions to ensure that the scenario is relevant to your company's context, such as geographical location or where you operate in the sector. So just to highlight a few aspects in this list here, in terms of carbon price, what assumptions are made about carbon price, how carbon pricing will develop over time, the geographic scope of implementation, whether carbon price will only apply at the margin or as a base cost, and whether it's applied to specific economic sectors or across the whole economy, so on and so forth. In terms of energy demand and mix, what would be the resulting, total energy demand and energy mix across different sources of primary energy? How does this develop over time, assuming that the supply or end use efficiency improvements? And what factors are used for energy conversion efficiencies for each source category and for end use efficiency in each category over time? In terms of policy, what are the assumptions made about the strength of different policy signals and their development over time? For instance, national headline carbon emission targets, or efficient energy efficiency, or technology standards, and policies in key sectors. And what about subsidies for fossil fuels, or subsidies for support for renewable energy sources and for other types of energy sources? So these are all kind of data sets and assumptions that all companies need to keep in mind when they are selecting the appropriate scenarios. So here's an analysis of the different types of scenarios used by Thai corporates in 2022, based on 2022 CDP submissions. So we can see that around 42% of companies utilize the RCP scenarios, followed by IEA. And generally, and this is for the Thai market, and generally in the Southeast Asia market, we also see RCP scenarios being the most widely used, as they're seen as the most stringent and ambitious scenarios since they are developed by the IPCC. So after selecting the appropriate scenarios, the next step is to assess your organization's exposure to climate risks. So as you might recall, in the earlier part of this webinar, we learned that there are two major categories of climate risks, which are transition risks as well as physical risks. So exposure to climate risks varies across sectors, industries, and individual organizations. Transition risk scenarios are particularly relevant for resource-intensive organizations with high greenhouse gas emissions within their value chains, where policy actions, technology or market changes aimed at emission reductions, energy efficiency, so on and so forth, may have a particularly direct effect. So key type of transition risk scenario is a so-called 2-degree scenario. So a 2-degree scenario provides a common reference point that is generally aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and will support investors' evaluation of the potential magnitude and timing of transition-related implications for individual organizations across different organizations within the sector and across different sectors. A wide range of organizations are exposed to climate-related physical risks. Physical risk scenarios are particularly relevant for companies exposed to acute or chronic climate change, such as those with, let's say, long-lived fixed assets, those in locations or operations in climate-sensitive regions, or with reliance on availability of water. Physical risk scenarios generally identify extreme weather threats of moderate or higher risk before 2030, and a larger number and range of physical threats between 2030 and 2050. Companies typically focus on the consequences of physical risk scenarios over shorter time frames that reflect the lifetimes of the respective assets or liabilities, which may vary across sectors and organizations. Although there are certain sectors with greater exposure, all sectors and parts of society will be exposed to risk. So as a systemic risk factor, it is important for companies to consider what other sectors or infrastructure they are reliant on. So after your organization has assessed the relevant transition and physical risks that are likely to impact them, The next step is to assess the business impacts as a result of these risks. So for instance, in terms of earnings, what conclusions does your company draw about the impact on earnings? And what does it impact? For instance, EBITDA margins or dividends. In terms of costs, what conclusions does your organization draw about the implications for its operating or production costs and their development over time? In terms of revenues, what conclusions do you draw about the implications for the revenues from its key commodities, products, services, and their development over time? In terms of assets, what are the implications for asset values of various scenarios? And in terms of, let's say, timing, what conclusions do you draw about the development of costs, revenues, and earnings across time, let's say in 10, 15, or 20 years? And in terms of, let's say, business interruption due to physical impacts, what is your company's conclusion about its potential business interruption or productivity loss due to physical impacts, both direct effects on your company's own assets and indirect effects on supply chain or product delivery disruptions? So an organization should really carefully consider the key parameters, assumptions, and other analytical choices made during scenario analysis, as well as the potential impacts or effects that are identified, and how those results are considered by management. And in particular, organizations are encouraged to disclose the approach used for selecting scenarios, as well as the underlying assumptions for each scenario regarding how a particular pathway might develop. For instance, the emergence and deployment of key technologies, policy developments and timing, and geopolitical environment around climate policies, etc. Transparency around key parameters, assumptions, and analytical choices will help support comparability of results between different scenarios used by the organization and across organizations. And this in turn will support the evaluation by analysts, investors, of the robustness of the organization's strategies across a range of plausible impacts, thereby supporting better risk and capital allocation decisions. So here we have a simplified version of the company's disclosure on how legal and reputational risk could affect their business operations and the response to this risk as a result of conducting scenario analysis. So while this is quite simple, I would say an improvement area for this disclosure would be to include more quantitative detail on the financial loss resulting from the litigation claims and reputational damage, as well as the cost of response to these risks. So this is the end of my session. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kelly, to walk us through the next section on climate risks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly, the Corporate Engagement Officer at CDP. Now for my parts, I will cover the risk assessment parts. First of all, I will introduce the major types of climate risk. Then I will share the common approaches to climate risk assessments with case studies. After that, I will introduce a practical guide that is designed to help Thai companies get started with their TCFD journey. Elizabeth and I cover in today's webinars can also, the case study that Elizabeth and I cover in today's webinar can also find in the guide. I will talk more about the guide and how you can make use of it later. And I will wrap up my parts by going through the TCFD reporting principles and some of the usual supporting materials. Basically, that's an overview of the content that I will cover. So now let's get started on risk assessment. For companies, there are some major challenges for them to conduct climate-related risk assessment. The financial impacts of climate-related issues on companies are not always very clear or direct. And for many companies, it's already been challenging to identify climate risks as they have limited knowledge of climate-related issues, and resourcing is a major barrier without the support of senior management and the board. companies may not be able to allocate a budget to hire external climate experts for conducting climate risk assessment. For those who conduct climate risk assessment, they tend to focus mainly on near-term risk without paying enough attention to risks that may arise in the longer term. Besides, many of them find it really difficult to quantify the impacts of climate-related risk. And I guess many of you have similar challenges that are shown in this slide. Therefore, I would love to give you an introduction to climate-related risks to enhance your understanding of them. So climate-related risks can be divided into two major categories. One is physical risk, which refers to risks associated with physical impacts of climate change. Another one is transition risk, which are those related to the transition to a low-carbon economy. The definitions of these two categories can be sound simple, but you may still find it a bit confusing about what exactly they mean. Usually, when we talk about physical risk, people will associate them with wildfires, storms, and floods. This risk results from climatic events. We call them acute physical risk. They are driven by specific weather events. What people usually are not familiar with is another type of physical risk called chronic physical risk. It's associated with long-term shifts in climate patterns, such as sustained high temperature, which may lead to sea level rise or chronic heat waves. Firms can be exposed to physical risk either directly or indirectly. For example, a factory might be directly impacted by being in an area that is becoming increasingly prone to flooding. But even if the factory itself is well protected from floods and other hazards, it could still be indirectly impacted if the supply chain is affected. Physical risk can have direct financial implications for companies, such as direct damage to assets and indirect impacts, including supply chain disruption. Another category of climate risk is transition risk. Transition risks are business-related risks that follow social and economic shifts towards a low-carbon and more climate-friendly future. There are four main drivers of transition risk suggested by TCFD. They include policy and legal risk, technology risk, market risk, and reputational risk. Transitioning to a low-carbon economy will entail extensive policy, legal, technology, and market changes to address mitigation and adaptation requirements related to climate change. Depending on the nature, speed, and focus on these changes, transition risk may pose varying levels of financial and reputational risk to company. In the next slide, I will take you through each of the transition risks. Policy actions around climate change continue to evolve. Their objectives generally fall into two categories: policy actions that attempt to constrain actions that contribute to the adverse effects of climate change, or policy actions that seek to promote adaptation to climate change. Some examples including implementing carbon pricing mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emission, shifting energy use towards lower emission sources, introducing carbon taxes, and mandating climate-related disclosures. These risks associated with and financial impacts of policy changes depend on the nature and timing of the policy change. Another important risk is legal risk. In recent years, there is a rising tide of many different types of climate-related litigation. This includes claims against directors or companies for contributing to climate change, situations concerning a firm's failure to adapt to climate change, and complaints against greenwashing. Some companies are even accused of insufficiency of disclosure around climate risk and its financial implication to their business. This litigation will cause companies financial and reputational harm. As the value of loss and damage arising from climate change grows, litigation risk is also likely to increase. For technology risk, technology advance have the potential to help speed up the transition to a low carbon economy. Examples are battery storage and carbon capture and storage. This implies that firms that are reliant on old fossil fuel technologies will be ripped for disruption unless they can adapt their business. There are also technology advancements improving the resilience to climate change. To the extent the new technology displaces old system and disrupts some parts of the existing economic system, winners and losers will emerge from this creative destruction process. The timing of technology development and deployment, however, is also a key uncertainty in assessing technology risk. In addition to the significant commercial opportunities that technology offers firms and investors, there is also risk that the technology is not widely adopted or proves unsuccessful. For market risk, the transition to a net zero economy will involve changes in the supply and demand of goods, services, and commodities, as well as shifts in their relative price. For example, the younger generation is eco-conscious to the point of changing their buying habits to favor environmentally friendly products. As the demand grows for environmentally friendly alternatives, firms that understand the market changes and adapt to the complex and dynamic context will navigate the transition more successfully than those who don't understand the nature of these changes. For reputation risk, climate change has been identified as the potential source of reputational risk tied to changing customer and community perceptions of a company's contribution to or distraction from the transition to a low carbon economy. Besides, investor awareness and expectation for firms also rising, with a number of incorporating climate risk consideration into their investment decisions. Companies' competitiveness, reputation, and long-term resilience may be impaired if they fail to address stakeholders' concerns of managing the climate risk. Now you probably have a better understanding of climate risk. Before I share with you some of the common approaches to climate risk management, I would love to give you a brief idea of what companies are expected to disclose when it comes to climate risk assessment. As Elizabeth mentioned previously, CDP questionnaire is fully aligned with TCFD recommendation. This slide shows the 4 key questions from our questionnaire that are related to climate risk assessment. First of all, we will ask companies if their process for identifying, assessing, and responding to climate-related risks and opportunities in question C 2.1. If companies select yes, we will then ask them to describe the process in detail in question C 2.2. For example, the stages of value chain that their risk assessment process covers. And company will also be presented with questions C 2.3 and 2.4 to indicate whether they have identified any climate-related risks and opportunities with the potential to have a substantive financial or strategy impact on their business. If the companies select no in question 2.1, they will not be presented with questions C 2.3 to C 2.4. However, they will be asked why does their organization not have a process in place for identifying, assessing, and responding to climate-related risks and opportunities? And do they plan to introduce such a process in the future? When companies fill out this question, they can know what is their current position in terms of climate risk assessment and areas that they can improve on. Besides, this allows stakeholders to gauge the fairness of a company's understanding of its exposure to climate-related issues and whether the company has the knowledge at the corporate level of any substantive climate-related risks and opportunities across any parts of its value chain. You probably wonder how Thai companies perform in climate risk management. We did an analysis of 2022 responses to climate risk management of around 100 Thai companies. Although these figures may not well represent the overall performance of over 800 Thai listed companies, this will give you some insights into the performance of Thai company that responds to CDP questionnaire. What we find is that the 2022 results is similar to the 2021 results. The difference is mainly due to the change in the responder size. Among all the 2022 Thai corporates that respond to CDP, 72% of Thai responders have a process for assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities, and 34% of Thai responders integrates climate risk into company-wide management process. Among those who have a process of climate risk assessment, nearly 60% of them conduct climate risk assessment once per year, and around 40% of them conduct more than once a year. Besides, over 80% of them integrate climate risk into multidisciplinary company-wide risk management process. Only 19% have a specific climate-related risk management process. And these figures show that Thai companies prefer to integrate climate risk into the overall risk process at company level. In 2022, 54% of Thai companies have identified climate-related risks with the potential to have a substantive financial or strategic impact on their business. Among those climate risks identified by Thai responders, 36% of them are physical risk and 64% of them are transition risk. Thai responders perceive transition risk to have a greater impact on their business than physical risk. The following content is developed based on the guidance published by COSO and WBCSD. The guidance aims to help entities to better understand the full spectrum of ESG risk. Besides, it also helps risk management and sustainability practitioners apply enterprise risk assessment, risk management concepts and process to ESG-related risk. Although climate risk is not exclusively an ESG issue, it falls under the environmental category. We can apply the concepts and processes of enterprise risk management suggested in this guidance to manage climate risk. As you see, the slide outlines the 4 key steps in managing climate risk. The first step is to identify the climate risks that impact your business. Then companies shall assess the severity of the risk and prioritize them as a basis for selecting responses to risk. After that, companies shall determine which of those risks and outcomes are a priority to manage and how to respond. One thing that I would like to highlight is that enterprise risk management is not a one and done activity. It's a dynamic process that requires ongoing review and revision of both individual risk and the ERM process overall. To identify climate risks that will have potential impacts on your business, companies need to understand the internal and external environment. You can start by reviewing peers' publications such as sustainability reports and annual reports. The climate risks that impact your peers are very likely to have certain impacts on your business. It's a good starting point to understand in what ways your business will be affected by climate risk. Besides, company can do megatrend analysis by referring to reports produced by consultancy on an annual basis, describing the top megatrends and an outlook on the future. They also offer specialized reports that are industry specific. Besides, company can consider engaging with internal and external stakeholders to gain insights into what and how climate risk affects their business. The engagement can be conducted in form of meetings and surveys. companies shall identify effective communication channels to engage different stakeholders. Materiality assessments, SWOT analysis, and impact and dependency mapping are more advanced approaches to understanding the internal and external environment. These are in-depth analytical approach and are suitable for companies with staff knowledgeable and skillful in doing the analysis. If you're interested in knowing how this approach can be applied to understand the internal and external environment, you can refer to the guidance developed by COSO and WBCSD in the previous slide. The next step in risk identification is to build a climate risk inventory. This lays the foundation for risk assessment and prioritization. After understanding the internal and external environment, companies shall be aware of what are the existing climate risks. So to build a climate risk inventory, company needs to define the criteria for what climate risk should be included in it. Some companies may include all climate risks that present potential impacts on the business strategy, objectives, and performance, while some may have some preliminary screenings on the climate risk and only include climate risks that impact their financial performance. Nevertheless, climate risk inventory shall not only include a list of climate risks, but also precise description of the climate risk identified and the drivers of the risk. Compared to more traditional risk, climate risk can change and evolve quickly due to factors such as emerging scientific data, new technology and innovations, etc. Due to these dynamic forces, companies continually monitor and for substantial changes in the external and internal environment to determine if any of these shifts trigger a change in the company risk inventory and require a response or decision from management. Companies shall also review their risk identification approach and decide whether they are still most appropriate when new approaches or data become available. Now I will share with you the practice of a CDP responder in identifying climate risk. I want to highlight that the case study we covered today are not necessarily the best practice. Best practice sometimes may seem too advanced for company at the early stage of their environmental journey. So we will rather provide a more accessible approach to guide companies to embark on their journey in climate risk management. This company builds a cross-functional teams to compile, review, and update climate risk inventory. The team is composed of designated personnel from different departments such as legal, finance, sustainability, operational, and human resources. They compile the climate risk inventory based on peer review, research or publication, and stakeholder engagement. They study the sustainability reports and CDP responses of their peers, which helps them to understand what climate risk may impact them from their peers' perspective. The team also studies the latest reports published by well-recognized organizations, such as the Global Risk Reports published annually by the World Economic Forum and publication released by Industry Association to understand the latest global and industry-specific climate challenge. Through stakeholder engagement, they can ensure they are aware of the latest climate-related regulations and emerging climate-related risks resulting from their suppliers or internal operation. Their climate risk inventory is reviewed on an annual basis. When potential new climate risks have emerged, the team will identify the potential relevance for the company and decide whether to include them in the climate risk inventory. After risk identification, the next step is to assess and prioritize risk identified. companies shall develop a set of assessment criteria and scales to assess climate risk. Well-established assessment criteria and scales can facilitate the analysis of climate risk and the risk prioritization process. Common criteria used for risk assessment include likelihood, magnitude of impact, adaptability, and recovery. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an example of criteria and rating scales that are used to assess climate risk. For example, likelihood can be divided into 5 categories. Each category is assigned a score. The number in the brackets represent the score. The higher the score, the more significant the risk. A well-defined rating scale is essential for consistent interpretation of the materiality of the climate risk identified. After setting the criteria, companies shall think about what approaches and tools to assess and rate the climate risk based on defined assessment criteria and rating scales. Common approach includes expert input, which is to harness the experience and knowledge of internal and external subject matter professionals in assessing the risk. Scenario analysis can address the potential implication of a range of long-term future states for risk under conditions of uncertainty. It helps companies to understand the magnitude of impacts of risk with a long-term, long time horizon. You can also leverage historical data to estimate the potential impacts of risk on revenues, costs, or profits. There are some climate-specific tools that can help you evaluate the impacts of vulnerability and adaptation to climate risk. Besides data from survey results, interviews, academic institutions, and think tanks can also be used as inputs in the risk assessment process. After assessing climate risk, companies can visualize the results using a risk matrix. A risk matrix can help you categorize risk with different materiality levels and facilitate the risk prioritization process. The graph on the right-hand side is an example of a risk matrix which plots vulnerability against hazard exposure. Climate risks are categorized into 4 levels of materiality according to their scores in the 2 dimensions. The overall score of a risk is calculated by multiplying its hazard exposure score by its vulnerability score. For example, a risk score 4 in hazard exposure and 5 in vulnerability, its overall score is 20, which is multiplying 4 by 5. Company can decide on the x-axis and y-axis of a risk matrix, develop their own calculation methodology, and define different levels of materiality and its criteria. In this case study, we can see the company assess climate risk based on 4 criteria, which are likelihood, time horizon, financial impact, and response to risk. It also defined the time horizon in the context of climate risk. This company has an expert team to assess and prioritize climate risk. The teams includes representatives from different departments such as sustainability, procurement, finance, operations, etc. They conduct a primary screening to remove risks that fall behind the long-term time horizon, or that fall within the time horizon but are below the financial materiality threshold of US $50 million. They share these screening results with C-suite executives and senior management for review and validation. The strategy planning department and risk management team will conduct an in-depth assessment of the risks validated and integrates them into existing enterprise risk management system. The risk management results incorporated with climate risk is reported to the executive committee and audit committee, which is involved in the risk prioritization process and evaluation of business strategies and objectives. To effectively manage risk, it's important to assign clear ownership for each risk response and to the appropriate risk owner. The risk owner is accountable for progress towards addressing the climate risk. He or she is responsible for assembling resources, such as setting up a cross-functional team for designing, implementing, and monitoring a risk response. The risk owner shall report the progress and effectiveness of the risk response to senior management on a regular basis. According to the COSO ARM framework, risk response fall within the categories of assets, avoid, pursue, reduce, and share. Assets risk means no actions are taken to change the severity of the risk. The response is appropriate when risks to the strategy and business objectives are within the risk appetite and not likely to become more severe. Avoiding risk refers to zero tolerance for the risk. It lists companies to avoid risk entirely or at least reduce the likelihood that it will occur. Pursuing risk means converting risk into opportunities. Responding to climate risk can unlock value for companies. Reducing risk refers to taking action to reduce the severity of the risk. And company may assess some levels of climate risk and then implement mitigation activities to reduce the risk to within its risk appetite. Sharing risk means transferring a portion of the risk or collaborating externally. This may eliminate some risk to individual companies for climate risk, and which may be too large or complex for an entity to manage. Companies shall consider different factors such as business context, costs and benefits, obligation, expectation, etc., when selecting appropriate risk responses. Once companies determine the approach, they implement their responses, which involve in developing and executing an action plan for each risk response. The plan for implementing a risk shall have clearly defined objectives, action points, timelines, key KPI, required resources, and estimation of costs and benefits. An effective risk response implementation plan should be incorporated into business strategy and at company level if the risk is substantial to the business. For example, a company considering achieving net zero by 2050 as a risk response to climate change, this overarching target should be supported and incorporated into overall business strategy, which will involve actions and supports from different levels of the company. Besides, metrics should also be developed to evaluate the effectiveness of the plan ahead of the execution stage. A designated team with well-defined responsibilities should execute the plan according to the timeline. In order to effectively execute the plan, regular reviewing and monitoring of the plan are essential, and risk owners should report the progress of the risk response to senior management so that they can understand how effectively they are addressing the risk, including whether the response brings the risk to within an acceptable level of performance. And in this case study, risk owners hold the accountability to manage the risk and report to the executive team and the board. Risk owners are authorized to assemble a cross-functional team and resources depending on the scope covered by the risk. The team work together to develop measures and plans to address specific risk based on the risk response chosen. The planning process will provoke discussion about how the measures and plans should be supported by the overall business strategy. This company identified carbon pricing as a material transition risk as it operates energy-intensive manufacturing sites in different regions such as the UK, EU, US, and China. Each region is subject to different carbon pricing policy. Regional teams are set up to develop measures and plans to reduce the severity of the risk brought by the regional carbon pricing policy. It has introduced energy efficiency, machinery, and source renewable energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Metrics such as annual greenhouse gas emissions are developed to evaluate the effectiveness of the measures. The risk owners and their cross-functional team evaluate the effectiveness of the measures based on predefined metrics. They also have to report to the executive team and the board on major issues regarding risk management on an annual basis. As the company anticipates stricter regulation on carbon pricing in the long term, it sets a target to reach net zero by 2050 as one of the business strategies at the company level. This is an example of integrating climate risk into business strategy planning. In today's webinar, Elizabeth and I dive into governance, scenario analysis, and risk management with case studies. We believe working on these three major areas will help companies to build a solid foundation for advancing their environmental journey. In these sessions, I will highlight the importance of a TCFD aligned roadmap and introduce a practical guide for you to kick off or advance your TCFD journey. First of all, what is a roadmap? We can understand it as a strategic plan that defines a goal or desired outcomes and includes the major steps or milestones needed to reach it. It's one of the most effective tools for rising above the granular details, giving you a bird's eye view of every key point of your TCFD journey. Each company shall design its own roadmap based on its desired goal and current environmental stage. The roadmap will allow you to quickly communicate your plan or strategy internally and externally and help you to measure the progress towards the goal. We designed a practical guide to help Thai companies get started with their TCFD journey. It will allow you to identify your stage in the environmental journey and inspire you to develop your own TCFD roadmap. The guide provides practical guidance to companies which are looking for to implement TCFD recommendation within their organization. Some of the content of this guide has already been covered in today's webinar, such as case studies on governance, climate scenario analysis, and climate risk management. Now I will walk you through the three key highlights of this guide. There is a section in the guide that explains the interdependency between all the four TCFD pillars and highlights the importance of reporting. It's illustrated by the graph in this slide. We think a robust governance structure can ensure that climate issues are addressed across the organization as a matter of priority and in an effective manner. It's a prerequisite to effectively identifying, assessing, and managing a wide spectrum of climate issues, as well as formulating an ambitious and practical climate strategy. Without a strong governance foundation on climate issues, it will be hard to push forward climate-related work effectively. On the other hand, risk management is too often seen as a compliance exercise and not truly integrated with business strategy planning. To effectively address climate challenge, companies should take climate-related issues into consideration when planning business strategies, and robust governance lay the foundation for successful climate risk management and integrated climate issues into business strategy. Besides, companies often underestimate the importance of climate reporting. Climate reporting is an important tool to communicate a company's performance and actions against climate-related issues By disclosing climate-related issues in a transparent way, companies can receive valuable feedback from their internal and external stakeholders, including investors, on how they can further improve their climate governance, strategies, and risk management. Companies can then evaluate their approach and strategies on climate-related issues and update their stakeholders on any significant changes, forming an effective feedback loop. In recent years, there is a growing number of climate-related litigation against companies. One of the main drivers is that companies fail to make adequate climate disclosure. This type of litigation underscores the importance of fair climate disclosure. Another highlight of the guide is that you can find a TCFD journey roadmap. The TCFD journey roadmap describes the characteristic or practice of company at 4 different environmental stages, namely early, developing, mature, and best practice, based on the 4 TCFD pillars. Here is a screenshot of the guide showing the 2 aspects under governance. It details the differences in governance practice at 4 different stages. For example, a company at mature stage has board oversight over climate issues, but the climate is not considered in the strategic decision-making process. The next step for this company will be to fully integrate climate issues into strategic planning and business model. Furthermore, it should have a mechanism in place to hold the board accountable for climate issues. We encourage companies to use this TCFD roadmap to determine which stage of environmental maturity your company is at, and identify the actions required to move up the ladder towards environmental stewardship. The guide also highlights and expands on 3 key areas, which are governance, climate scenario analysis, and climate risk management. The report consolidates some examples of good practices, which are developed based on real-world cases. These examples are used to illustrate how the TCFD recommendations are implemented and provide insights to companies to develop their own strategy and approach. The case studies and examples included in this report do not demonstrate the only approach to implementing the TCFD recommendation, but rather serve as examples to illustrate how they have been implemented in practice as a reference. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and companies should adapt the TCFD recommendation to their unique organizational context. This slide summarizes the key steps of developing a TCFD-aligned roadmap and the relevant sessions you can find in this guide. As I said, the TCFD journey roadmap can help you understand your current stage in the environmental journey and the gaps between best practice. This can inspire your company to develop a TCFD-aligned roadmap with a clear vision and objectives. This session key action points will give you additional insights into developing the roadmap on governance, scenario analysis, and risk management. Now it comes to the section of reporting principles and supporting materials. And this slide gives you a brief idea of the 7 principles of effective disclosure, which include relevant material, disclosing relevant and material information. The disclosure should be specific and complete, and the disclosure should also be clear, balanced, and understandable. And companies should disclose the information, consistent information over time to enable users to understand the development and evolution of the impact of climate-related issues on your company business. Besides, the information disclosure should also be comparable among organizations within a sector, industry, or portfolio, and the information should also be reliable, verifiable, and objective. And another key principle is the disclosure should be provided on a timely basis. So here you can see the topics for achieving good practice, and for governance, company can ensure that the distinction between board and management level accountabilities is efficiently distinct, and the connection between these two levels is addressed. And for risk management, company need to ensure business and context specific actions are included alongside the disclosure of material climate risk and to evidence to mitigation. We have 10 points checklist which cover everything. On the left-hand side, the first 2 points are about mainstreaming climate-related risk and opportunities through internal cooperation and integration. The third point is related to making most of your company risk management process. The next point is using existing quality assurance and compliance approaches for identifying and evaluating climate risks and financial impacts. Number 5 is using existing tools such as CDP questionnaire to collect data. And another bullet point is to engaging investor for feedback reporting as if your report is going to be assured, and also use your mainstream reports as a vehicle for disclosure. So to help you prepare for TCFD aligned disclosure, you may look through the checklist and think about how your organization to apply these steps internally. Through this process, you will be able to identify the barriers your organization may face. As a result, organization can prioritize actions and allocate resources to overcome these barriers and start reporting as recommended by TCFD. The checklist is an excellent tool to help you quickly examine your readiness, whereas TCFD official website hosts lots of detailed guidance explaining specific areas of TCFD disclosures. For example, guidance aimed at companies who are interested in integrating climate-related risk into their existing risk management process, and technical supplements advises company on conducting climate-related scenario analysis. TCFD also publishes stated reports regularly, which describe the progress companies are making in implementing the TCFD recommendation. The TCFD Knowledge Hub is an e-learning platform developed by the Climate Disclosure Standard Board and the TCFD. It provides the latest tools, resources, and case studies and insights to help companies learn about disclosing climate-related information and implement the TCFD recommendation. It's a database containing all types of TCFD related materials that is accessible to the public. From the Knowledge Hub, you can also enroll for free courses that are designed to fill in the organization's knowledge gap and enhance their disclosures of climate-related information. Content of these courses was developed with insights from industry experts and is suitable for a range of audience, from those who are new to climate reporting to those who want to build on their existing skill sets. While the information provided in a CDP response cover much of the same ground as the TCFD recommendation, is best practice for these materials, climate-related financial disclosures, to be included in the financial annual reports to meet the expectation of TCFD. CDSB and CDP came together and create a new guide called Building Block, which step-by-step explains how you can take your information in CDP and reports it's in your mainstream reports. We do this by highlighting the most relevant CDP climate change questions and explaining how this information can be used for reporting in the mainstream reports using CDSB's reporting principles and requirements. For more examples of TCFD aligned disclosure, you may download the TCFD Good Practice Handbook from the link embedded on this slide. TCFD recommendations proceed from the starting point that climate change is a financial risk, and the 4 pillars within TCFD and the TCFD recommendations indicate to investors and companies what they should evaluate. Our climate change questionnaire provides companies with a breakdown of TCFD recommendations into accessible metrics, which can be extracted by stakeholders for evaluation and benchmarking. CDP enable investors and other data users to access standardized, comparable, and decision-useful data, providing them with actionable insights. Our guidance materials and supporting content tell companies exactly what data each question is looking for and what information needs to be provided. Company can use our guidance to identify, collect, and report relevant data. Our scoring methodology is fully transparent as is available on our website, and as a result, this incentivizes some disclosure and rewards company for following best practice. Because of how our questionnaire is structured, which is in a standardized format, it uses structured data sets, which provides data users with actionable insights. We can see a lot of company disclosing through CDP to make disclosure aligned with TCFD. So CDP provides a lot of resources to support company in disclosing climate information through our questionnaire. You can access the climate change questionnaire from our website. We develop reporting guidance to help company understanding the rationale behind each question. Another key resources is the scoring methodology, which lists the scoring criteria of each question. And apart from questionnaires and scoring related documents, technical materials are also available. For example, the technical notes reporting on transition plans shows how companies should disclose through CDP, can demonstrate that they have a credible climate transition plan. So that's my presentation, and thank you for your listening. Now I will pass the time to Matthias.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Elizabeth. It was a very insightful and a very detailed walkthrough for our audience today on how to do the TCFD disclosures. So right now we have a special feature for all of you today, focusing on the topic of gender equality and social inclusion. So even as the world grapples with climate change and the decarbonization efforts, there has been an ongoing and very parallel discussion around what we call the just transition. And the just transition, is still a very nascent discussion, but it's a very important one. We conducted a survey across companies, and it was one of the issues that I think was requested that we cover as part of this webinar today. So the just transition seeks to safeguard groups of people who may be inadvertently marginalized as climate change takes place and as the world reacts to it. It seeks to attribute the cost of both mitigation and adaptation in a fair and just manner. Many studies have shown that there is a direct link between gender, social equity, and climate change. For example, women suffer disproportionately from climate change impacts, and so too those in more impoverished communities. Our guest speaker today, covering this topic today, is Ms. Empiwa Gawande. Empiwa is a student researcher, marketing enthusiast, and a multi-talented recording and performing artist. Having graduated from the African Leadership Academy and currently enrolled at the world-renowned Yale NUS College in Singapore, Empiwa has developed skills in gender studies, qualitative research, market research, social media marketing, and creative arts. She has great experience from various stints from developing social media campaigns for Paragon, as the marketing director of Model African Union, the co-organizer of the 2020 South African Ideas Festival, and also she's also spent time with CDP. Over all these experiences, MPY has honed her skills in project management and community development through founding and organizing the nationwide 2018 Guinness World Record breaking Z Marimba Festival. She's also a Bezos Scholar, and MPY has performed original music on stages in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Singapore, and the United States. And as part of this presentation, she hopes to strengthen the knowledge and awareness of African cultures among other world cultures. So without further ado, please welcome MPY. MPY, please.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and good morning to everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and well said by Matthias. There's nothing else to add. As marginalized groups continue to be affected by the transitioning period, as we incorporate sustainability efforts, we need to be able to acknowledge how we can better integrate gender equality and social inclusion in internal policy making amongst organizations like yours. So I will just share screen and then we can continue. Thank you. Okay. All right, so today we'll be talking about gender equality and social inclusion, and its relevance in this capacity building workshop is how we can better mainstream gender equality and social inclusion. And since it's a mouthful, we'll shorten it to GESI, how we can better mainstream GESI in Thailand companies' sustainability efforts, climate risk assessments, and organizational performances. So for the agenda, we'll first start off with what is GESI? And how can we better include GESI in environmental talks? And then we'll move on to what is the current context for GESI in Thailand? Which means what are the reporting requirements in Thailand? And then afterwards, we'll look at what are some examples of good practice, plus common challenges that have been experienced in implementing GESI. And then after that, we'll finish off with what is the future of GESI. So we'll start off with the definitions. GESI is defined as gender equality, which is the first bit, right? And this is where women, men, girls and boys, where women, men, boys and girls have equal conditions, treatments and opportunities for realizing their full potential, human rights, dignity, and for contributing to and benefiting from economic, social, cultural, and political development. So equality manifests itself in forms of values and methods, which is also equity, which is what Matthias mentioned, leadership and objectives, right? And then the second bit of GESI, which is the SI, social inclusion, that is the process of improving the terms of opportunities for people who are disadvantaged because of their identity. So those people who are at risk of poverty, people who are marginalized, people who have social exclusion, they can also gain the opportunities and resources to participate in fully economic, social, and political and cultural life. So the next bit of our presentation is why should we include GESI in environmental talks? It is, as mentioned by Matthias, so we can start off with the right-hand one. All right, mainstreaming GESI has been seen to be have a direct link with better performance in an organization. So what that looks like is that there's both in non-academic and academic sources that state that there is a direct link between gender diversity as well as high performance in environmental, financial, and executive aspects of an organization, including a 2017 McKinsey and Company worldwide study, which found that organizations that mainstream GESI, that implement gender diversity in their boards, as well as their executive workforce, has positive implications for a firm's value and performance. Right. And also on the left side, we can see that it is a recognizable business case and risk, not only because of the right-hand side, but then also because it can help for an organization to internally create policies that practice towards encouraging gender diversity. It stands as a risk as we are looking at climate risk assessments, gender diversity stands as a risk to be accounted for by an organization like yours and its stakeholders. So looking into Thailand's GESI context, so far the data that we have is provided by organizations like the United Nations Women Organization. And so far what we've seen is that Thailand has done comparatively well in comparison to the rest of the world. So 24% of all CEOs in Thailand, according to UN Women, are women and managing directors, as well as over 100 companies in Thailand have pledged to strengthen women's economic empowerment through becoming signatories for the WEPs, which is the Women's Empowerment Principles. So we'll look into what those are in a minute, but based on these two statistics, we can see that there is a building of assets, capabilities, and opportunities for women and marginalized groups that is emerging in Thailand. So there are GESI reporting requirements in Thailand already that exist that are also not just on a global level, like what we've seen in UN Women, but also on a national level. So the Securities and Exchange Commission in Thailand has initiated a 20-year national strategy from 2017 to 2036, where the principles involve mitigating inequality and creating multidimensional justice. So that looks like social insurance schemes are accessible by everybody. So this includes gender and age. So this is more about social inclusion. And then there is more on the gender equality side, social empowerment. So promoting gender equality and women's roles in social development. So in addition to the 20-year national strategy, we also have the 2017 Corporate Governance Code that was issued also by the SEC. And this one talks about the advantages of including gender diversity in executive positions. So some of those benefits involve improved customer insights, mission statements, and goodwill in a company. There's also less blind spots in decision-making. There's reduced negligence. And then there's also diverse solutions and more innovation. So based on these things, this is just a vouching for the benefits of what it looks like to have GESI incorporated in internal organizations. In addition to that, SEC also issued a 2021 report, which is called the 56-1, okay? And they require disclosure on ESG performances. All right, so that involves environmental, social, and governance data performance disclosure. So that is disclosing progress towards attaining sustainability and maintaining ethical standards and ESG criteria. They also encourage board diversity policy disclosure, as well as the implementation methods. And then also the gender data, which is the pure numbers in terms of the director, the general employee, and board leadership levels. In addition to that, the government also requires that the organizations also become signatories of WEPs. So this is why over 100 organizations in Thailand are remarkably WEP signatories. So the women's empowerment principles are principles that offer guidance to businesses on how to promote gender equality and women's empowerment in the workplace, in the marketplace, and also in the community. And they're principles that are established by the UN Global Compact, which is another global organization in 2010. And they're informed by international labor and human rights standards, grounded in the recognition that businesses have a stake, a responsibility for gender equality and women's empowerment. So their principles involve treating women and men fairly, high corporate leadership, community initiative and advocacy, employee health, well-being and safety, as well as education and training for career advancement. So based on all of these reporting requirements that are in Thailand, there is definitely a remarkable performance that have been displayed by organizations in Thailand when it comes to the implementation of GESI, both internally as well as in external projects. So some examples of exemplary GESI practices that we have seen in Thailand so far is the first thing, which is reporting to and being a signatory of the WEPs, which is what we've just looked at, another standard, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, which is not just limited to gender equality, but includes it, as well as the UN Global Compact, being a signatory of that. So we'll start off with the most right. The United Nations Global Compact is a voluntary non-binding pact that just requires organizations to submit communications on progress on how they are attaining their own goals towards sustainability as well as human rights in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Reporting Initiative, which is the one in the middle, is a set of international standards that companies also use to disclose their organizational behavior through sustainability reports that are submitted on an annual basis. And as of 2022, over 10,000 companies voluntarily disclose using GRI standards when it comes to this, and as well as women's empowerment principles, which is what we've just looked at. So a lot of organizations are signatories of these three bodies, or are participants or report to these bodies, which in turn creates a very elaborate and coherent presentation of performance disclosure data, which is what organizations in Thailand do very well. So there is elaborate, coherent, and transparent disclosure of organizational performance towards attaining sustainability in their progress reports. And additionally, the internal organizational format of GESI in these organizations in Thailand include auditing, risk or diversity, equity and inclusion committees, independent unions, and working groups that are specifically catered to addressing gender-related and social inclusion issues. So some organizations in Thailand have created these bodies so that they can tackle these issues that occur within the internal organization. Additionally, there's also very good goal setting because there is the ambition that is stated in sustainability reports at the end of the year that there is an ambition for more female representation in all bodies. And these goals that are stated are usually specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, and to attain gender equal leadership. So in addition to that, there also is another side where the common challenges are experienced in GESI practice. So currently, as it stands in Thailand and in general around the world, there is a gap between GESI and corporate social responsibility. So there tends to be a bit of a lack, and there needs to be a stronger link between gender equality, social inclusion, and existing environmental and corporate social responsibility practices, especially when it comes to internal policy-making procedures. This means that while organizations attempt to account for risk in terms of corporate social responsibility practices, gender equality tends to take a backseat in terms of people who are marginalized. In addition to that, executive leadership still experiences some challenges where there is more, there are still largely male-dominated executive leadership bodies in board of directors as well. In addition to that, there is a problem. Sometimes there tends to be a problem with compliance with standards. So reporting to the WEPs, the United Nations Global Compact, as well as the GRI, sometimes data is not as explicitly stated, especially when it comes to GRI 405-2, which is the ratio of basic salary and remuneration of female to male employees in compliance with that standard. So there is a need for greater transparency and a widespread commitment to GESI when it comes to reporting with those standards. Now, in tandem with that, we can present some solutions in terms of what is the future of GESI. And the first thing definitely is that practical policies and resolutions for equity need to be implemented. So GESI needs to be looked at in terms of resolving pay gaps through equitable solutions and allocating equitable decision-making power instead of looking at GESI as the disclosure of male to female ratios. in addition to that, GESI needs to now start being contained by CSR. So GESI will be prioritized among other social risks that are audited by organizations and seen as equally important. In addition to that, GESI can also be seen as a social benefit in organizations, not just a corporate benefit, but also for CSR, as well as mission statements and goodwill. In addition to that, what we also see is that the gender binary will also disappear when it comes to men and women. There will be more gender diversity that will be included, as well as better decision-making that is inclusive of all types of genders. And there's also access to basic human rights. So GESI is not just for corporates or for equity, but also the general amelioration of access to human rights. So that includes opportunities and decision-making being unaffected by gender at all times, and elaborate performance disclosure as data. So this is one of the most important things, because GESI is a positively reinforcing loop where data in itself will just inherently improve when it comes to disclosure of male to female numbers, as well as all other ambitions and goals towards mainstreaming GESI in an organization. So there will be extensive reporting in accordance with standards, just in tandem with all TCFD disclosure, and there was also a succinct comprehension of data, and that very data can also be leveraged for internal GESI policy making and initiatives, as well as external projects that are carried out by an organization. So there is a bright future when it comes to mainstreaming GESI. It has a positive influence on both an organization's internal organizing, as well as its external projects. So the quote, just to finish off with, is to say, is by a renowned women's rights activist, and she says that virtue can only flourish amongst equals. So while creating a TCFD aligned roadmap, how can GESI be internally integrated, as well as also externally carried out by organizations like yours? And how can it be something that can better the environment for climate risk assessment, as well as also improve the goodwill of your own organization? So I hope this was a helpful presentation for a topic like this, and it helps us create a more well-rounded perspective of what it looks like to have better climate risk assessment, as well as TCFD aligned disclosure and performance disclosure in your organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mpiwa. So I mean, this is an interesting topic. And I know we are running a bit behind schedule. You know, in response to Mpiwa's presentation, you know, I just want you all to ponder on this question: is gender and social equality truly achievable? You know, is this just transition truly achievable? What would that future look like, right? So anyway, we'd just like to invite Elizabeth and Kelly, you know, back to the panel. We're just going to take a few questions. If you have any outstanding questions, please, you know, use the Q&A box. So the first question that, you know, we carried over from the previous round was this question on, I think we do have a spectrum of companies, you know, in Thailand, and as part of this audience as well. And, you know, for the large corporates, large conglomerates, and also for asset managers who operate funds, right? They have a wide range of and portfolio of assets, you know, and the question was, you know, is there a way that companies could standardize scenario analysis across this variety of assets, across this variety of operations, whether from a corporate or from a asset manager's perspective?
Yeah, so I think standardization of scenario analysis is possible, but it'll be very difficult because because you know different types of assets or different types of business activities might be presented with a very different set of risks, and you know future predictions are, I mean futures are very hard to predict. So yes, it's possible, but it will take a bit of work. So I guess one way to go about this is through stakeholder engagement, to kind of understand, I mean, in terms of like, if you're talking about different business activities, then it'll take some stakeholder engagement to understand different views of different people, different staff from different business units, before deciding on which standardized approach the entire company would like to take. And I think this will also require a bit of two-way discussion, both top-down and bottom-up approaches. But then I do agree that standardization is very important, so that everyone across the board is aligned and is clear on what to do and what to expect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So from the large corporates, we do have a question for the smaller companies as well. For smaller companies without the resources, and with the simplified governance structures, is there a way that we should that these companies should go about consolidating I guess their TCFD implementation, their climate risk management, and there has been a recent talk about outsourcing as well. In fact, Dr. Darren McBain, who used to be the sustainability chief of Thai Union, right, has started an outsourcing of chief sustainability officer initiative. So Elizabeth, Kelly, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there are kind of like two ways you can go about it, right? Outsourcing and consolidation. So in terms of so we can narrow this down. In terms of getting people with climate expertise on the board, let's say, outsourcing, we have to be very careful about outsourcing because assessing climate change expertise or even sustainability expertise is a very new area of assessment. And we have to be really careful about the cultural and local factors when looking at climate issues, because climate issues are being dealt differently in different countries and different with very different local contexts. So in this case, I would say that consolidation is a better option. But even if we take the consolidation route, I think it's very important to reconcile any conflicts of interest. So for instance, an audit function or an enterprise risk management function with their perspective may have the interest to downplay the risk from climate just due to the nature of their work. And in such case, having a separation of that climate change function versus the risk management and audit functions might be more useful. Or having key stakeholders within each committee, having that multidisciplinary approach that we mentioned earlier in the presentation, with a clear focus overall, would probably be more helpful. As well as having kind of performance incentives tied to those specific performance indicators around climate risk management might also be helpful to kind of position everyone in the right direction. So again, that's one way you can take, and that's probably, and finally, independent reviews of a company's climate plans are probably also useful. Just again, outside view, subjective view on a company's climate plans. So that's kind of where external benchmarks such as CDP could play a role in helping a company benchmark your climate plans and assessment with others across the sector.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to all the presenters, to Elizabeth, to Kelly, to Mpiwa. Thank you as well to John for the opening address. I think we answered fully almost all the questions that were posed on the Q&A. So right now, we would just like to conclude our program. But before we leave, on behalf of my colleagues in CDP, as well as our partners, we would like to thank everybody again, the speakers, as well as to every single participant who joined us this morning. But before you leave, we would really appreciate if you can take just 5 minutes to complete a short survey to provide feedback on the session. You can use a link on the screen or the QR code that's flashed on the screen. So I'll just give you, a few minutes, and thank you once more for all your participation. Yep, so we have come to the end of the webinar. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar is recorded and we will share a link to the recording and slide deck, and we will provide the slide deck to all the attendees. We hope to see you all again in the future. Khop Kun Kap, farewell, but not goodbye. See you again.